The rise of fascism in the United States over the last 50 years has been a challenging and disparaging problem. Hello, I'm Atomic Dave, also known as the real voice of that David Boles if he were a robot. Meow. In this InHuman Meme podcast, we will investigate the rise of fascism with the help of our delightful AI friends, and voice, and dramatic performances. Onward, shall we? Fascism is a political ideology that is characterized by extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, militarism, and racism. Fascism emerged in Europe in the aftermath of World War I and reached its peak in the 1930s and 1940s with the regimes of Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, and others. The history of fascism in the USA over the last 50 years is not as clear-cut as in Europe, but there have been some movements and groups that have displayed fascist tendencies or sympathies. Some examples are the American Nazi Party, founded by George Lincoln Rockwell in 1959, was a neo-Nazi organization that advocated white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and violence. The party was involved in several rallies, protests, and clashes with civil rights activists and anti-fascists. Rockwell was assassinated by a former member in 1967. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist hate group that originated in the Reconstruction era, experienced a resurgence in the 1960s and 1970s, fueled by opposition to the civil rights movement, desegregation, and immigration. The Klan used terror tactics such as cross-burnings, bombings, lynchings, and assassinations to intimidate and harm African Americans, Jews, Catholics, and other minorities. The Klan also had ties to some politicians and law enforcement officials who shared their views. The John Birch Society, founded by Robert Welch in 1958, was a right-wing organization that promoted anti-communism, conspiracy theories, and limited government. The society accused many prominent figures of being communists or communist sympathizers, including President Dwight Eisenhower, Martin Luther King Jr., and Earl Warren. The society also opposed civil rights legislation, the United Nations, the Federal Reserve, and other aspects of the U.S. government that they deemed as threats to American sovereignty and freedom. The Patriot movement, which emerged in the 1990s and 2000s, was a loose network of militias, survivalists, sovereign citizens, and other anti-government extremists who believed that the U.S. government was illegitimate and tyrannical. The movement was influenced by various ideologies such as Christian identity, white nationalism, libertarianism, and conspiracy theories. Some members of the movement were involved in violent acts such as the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992, and the Waco siege in 1993. The alt-right, which rose to prominence between 2010 and 2020, was a term used to describe a diverse group of online activists who espoused white nationalism, neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, homophobia, and other forms of bigotry. The alt-right used memes, trolling, harassment, and propaganda to spread their views and influence mainstream politics. Some members of the alt-right participated in violent events such as the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. The current state of fascism in the USA is a matter of debate and concern among scholars, journalists, and citizens. According to some sources, fascism is a political ideology that is characterized by extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, militarism, and racism. Fascism emerged in Europe in the aftermath of World War I and reached its peak in the 1930s and 1940s with the regimes of Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, and others. Some experts argue that fascism or fascism-like movements have been present in the USA for decades, and have grown more extreme and influential in recent years, especially under the presidency of Donald Trump. They point to various factors that have contributed to the rise of fascistic politics in the USA, such as the history of racism, slavery, segregation, and white supremacy in the USA, which has created a fertile ground for fascist solutions to national problems. The resurgence of hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party, the Patriot Movement, and the alt-right, which have advocated and practiced violence, intimidation, and bigotry against minorities, immigrants, and other perceived enemies. The spread of conspiracy theories, misinformation, and propaganda through social media and other platforms, which have eroded trust in democratic institutions, science, and facts. The polarization of the political system and the erosion of civil discourse, which have created a climate of hostility, resentment, and fear among different segments of society. The manipulation of the electoral system and the judiciary by Republican politicians and their allies, who have sought to undermine voting rights, gerrymander districts, stack courts, and overturn election results. The mobilization of a large and loyal base of supporters by Trump and his allies, who have exploited their grievances, fears, and prejudices, and have incited them to violence and insurrection. There are different ways to identify the signs of fascism, but some common features that have been observed in fascist movements and regimes are powerful and continuing nationalism. Fascists promote a sense of national pride, unity, and superiority over other countries and peoples. They often use symbols, slogans, and rituals to appeal to the emotions of the masses. Disdain for human rights. Fascists disregard the rights and dignity of individuals and groups that they consider inferior or enemies. They often use violence, torture, imprisonment, and execution to suppress dissent and opposition. Identification of enemies as a unifying cause. Fascists create a sense of common threat and scapegoat by blaming certain groups or individuals for the problems and failures of the nation. They often target minorities, immigrants, foreigners, communists, socialists, liberals, Democrats, and others. Rampant sexism. Fascists uphold a patriarchal and misogynistic view of society and gender roles. They often discriminate against women, limit their rights and opportunities, and condemn homosexuality. Controlled mass media. Fascists censor, manipulate, or monopolize the sources of information and communication. They often use propaganda, lies, and fake news to spread their ideology and agenda. Obsession with national security. Fascists exaggerate the dangers and threats to the nation from external or internal enemies. They often use fear and paranoia to justify militarization, surveillance, and repression. Religion and government intertwined. Fascists exploit or impose a certain religion or religious doctrine to legitimize their rule and policies. They often claim to have a divine mandate or mission to fulfill. Corporate power protected. Fascists favor the interests and profits of big businesses and corporations over the welfare and rights of workers and consumers. They often collaborate with or co-opt the economic elites to maintain their power. Labor power suppressed. Fascists oppose or eliminate the organizations and movements that represent the interests and demands of workers. They often ban unions, strikes, protests, and other forms of collective action. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Fascists reject or attack the values and contributions of intellectuals, artists, scientists, and educators. They often censor, ban, or destroy any works or expressions that challenge or criticize their ideology or regime. Obsession with crime and punishment. Fascists enforce a strict and harsh system of law and order to maintain social control and discipline. They often use arbitrary arrests, trials, sentences, and executions to deter or eliminate any opposition or deviation. What is the future for us? Will fascism continue to rise over the next 50 years, or will it fall away like a mask on a false face? Well, predicting the rise or fall of fascism over the next 50 years in America is a difficult and uncertain task, as there are many factors and variables that can influence the course of history. However, based on the current trends and scenarios, I can offer some possible outcomes and implications. One possible outcome is that fascism will continue to rise and gain more power and influence in American politics and society, especially if the economic, social, and environmental crises worsen, and if the democratic institutions and norms are further eroded or corrupted. In this scenario, the fascist movements and groups will exploit the fears, grievances, and prejudices of a large segment of the population and will mobilize them to support a charismatic and authoritarian leader who promises to restore order, security, and greatness to the nation. The fascist leader and regime will use propaganda, censorship, violence, and repression to suppress any opposition or dissent, and will pursue aggressive and expansionist policies that threaten the stability and peace of the world. Another possible outcome is that fascism will decline and lose its appeal and relevance in American politics and society, especially if the economic, social, and environmental problems are addressed effectively, and if the democratic institutions and norms are strengthened and reformed. In this scenario, the fascist movements and groups will be exposed, isolated, and rejected by the majority of the population, who will value diversity, tolerance, and cooperation over hatred, division, and conflict. The democratic leaders and movements will use education, dialogue, activism, and innovation to promote a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable vision for the nation. The democratic leader and regime will use diplomacy, multilateralism, human rights, and justice to foster a more harmonious and peaceful world. We must fight fascism. We must fight to include all people. That means we must be active and we must vote. Please vote for goodness and for freedom. Fight against cruelty and perceptuality. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I thank you for joining me here on this Human Meme podcast. And remember to always be a human meme.